Hi, this is Ron Cipcic, and this is the second part of a three-part series on macroeconomic disequilibrium. In the previous section, we talked about the basic disequilibrium condition, and that would be where GDP is either greater than TPE, total planned expenditures, or GDP is less than total planned expenditures. Of course, if we're in equilibrium, which is very rare, GDP would be equal to total planned expenditures. In this particular segment, what we want to do is we want to take some macroeconomic data, hypothetical macroeconomic data, and we actually want to test these propositions and then see what the consequences are of macroeconomic disequilibrium. What we will find in this particular example is that the economy is not in equilibrium, and because it's not in equilibrium, it will move to another point. In other words, GDP will change. And again, what we're trying to really do here, let me move this data. Let me move this data for a minute and show you. What we're actually trying to do is we're trying to show why GDP changes. We have already talked about business fluctuations, and remember, GDP fluctuates over time. So if this is time and this is real inflation-adjusted GDP, what we see is that GDP fluctuates over time even when there's economic growth. So if you look at our data for the United States over the last, let's say 80 years, what you're going to see is you're going to see this kind of pattern. You're going to see a basic upward movement in the data. So in other words, if we fit a trend line to this data, the trend is upwards, but you're going to see movement around that trend line. And so if we actually box that movement in, you'll see this is like a highway, and this speaks of economic growth because real GDP is increasing over time, but you can see that the car is swerving along the road, which indicates that you have periods of up and you have periods of down. Now, we've already talked about this. We've said that really macroeconomics was birthed out of the Great Depression. So it's these downturns that are of particular concern to economists. And so in this particular example, we're actually going to set out a case explaining why there are downturns, why there are recessions, why real GDP declines. Most of the time, real GDP is increasing. The United States is a growth system. We grow most of the time. GDP is expanding most of the time. It's rare that GDP be in a period of contraction. So it's these periods of contraction that really cause people to question what's going on in the macroeconomy, and it really causes people to want to study the macroeconomy and how it works so people, policymakers in particular, can make forecasts about where the system is going. And maybe the only thing we can do is we can warn people. But it also could be that maybe there are policies that can be undertaken to help mitigate or make less the severity of the downturn. All right, so in this particular example, let me go back up to the data. I've given you some data here. We see that we've got some product side data. We've got G, M, X, and IP. We don't have C. We'll have to find that. So C is actually an unknown in this particular data, but we have data to find it, and we'll show how to find it. But notice, we're going to need TPE, and remember what TPE is. TPE is C plus I planned plus G plus X minus M. So on this left side, we have the 5 components that we need to make the TPE, or total planned expenditure, calculation. These actually are going to be organized to calculate TPE. Now, this is the income side over here, and with the income side, we'll be able to find GDP. From this, we'll be able to find GDP, and from this side, we'll also be able to find C. Remember, we can take national income and find GDP, and we can take national income and work down to C. All right, and that, in fact, is what we're going to do. Now, remember, we need TPE and we need GDP to know whether the economy is in equilibrium or not. All right, so the first thing we'll do is we'll calculate GDP. So let me scroll down here. Let me scroll down and make some room for this. In fact, I'll do this calculation actually right over here to the right. So how do we take this data and find GDP? Well, if we take national income, let me get rid of this. Whoop. Let me get rid of this. Let's try again. If I write in red, it's going to drive you crazy because it's too bold. So let me go back to black. So if you take national income and you add back depreciation allowances, you get GDP. Very simple calculation here. Very simple calculation. Now, if you look at the data up above, national income is what? It's 800. Depreciation allowances right here is 80. So we can go the income approach. We can take national income and work back up to GDP. What do we get? We get 880. So GDP is 880 in this problem. All right, so that solves one of the mysteries. We have GDP. We didn't have it. It wasn't given to us, but we can calculate it from the income side of the accounts. Now, we need C because we have to get total planned expenditures. Remember, TPE is equal to C plus I planned plus G plus X minus M. We need TPE. We have I planned, we have G, we have X, and we have M, but we don't have C. So we have to solve for C. So how do we actually find C? Well, we're going to use the income side of the accounts. Remember this. So let's write this out. And again, this should be review. This should not be new to you. We've actually worked on this in earlier lessons. So if we take national income and we subtract what? We subtract indirect business taxes. We subtract corporate Social Security taxes. Excuse me. We subtract corporate income taxes. We subtract retained earnings. We add back government transfers. What do we get? We get personal income. Remember, personal income is the income level that actually flows into households. Move that up a little bit. And then if we subtract from personal income personal taxes, we get disposable income. Disposable income is what households have to spend or save. And then if we subtract from disposable income saving by households, what do we get? We get C. So we can go all the way down from national income to C, and we ought to be able to do that. So this number will turn out to be 800. Okay, and then what's indirect business taxes? We need to know that. We have to scroll up. So maybe rather than scrolling up, I'll just plug these numbers in. So indirect business taxes are, let me get that, are 95. Corporate Social Security taxes are 55. Corporate income taxes are 30. Retained earnings are 10. You have to know, and you'll notice I gave the data up above. I didn't tell you how to use the data. I just gave you the data. You have to know what to subtract and what to add and all that. So you have to be able to put the minus. You have to know the model. So 800 minus 95 minus 55 minus 30 minus 10 plus government transfers. Well, government transfers are given to be 90. So if we actually do the calculation here, this will turn out to be 700. Okay, if you actually subtract these four things and add this one thing, you're going to get 700. Then if we subtract personal taxes of 115, you're going to get disposable income of what? Well, that's going to turn out to be 585. And then if you subtract saving by households of 60, you're going to get C of 525. Now look, I could give you C, and that would obviously shorten the calculation time of this problem, but I expect that you know how to go from national income to C. Okay, so let's now calculate TPE. So C plus I planned plus G plus X minus M equals TPE. So what do we have here? What do we have? We've got 525. We have found C. We've got 145 plus 215 plus 180 minus 200 equals, what do we get? We get 865. So total planned expenditures equal 865. Now, is this macroeconomy in equilibrium? The answer is no. No. Remember, equilibrium is a condition where GDP equals TPE. That is not the case. In this case, GDP is greater than TPE. Remember, GDP is our measure of aggregate supply. TPE is our measure of aggregate demand. So GDP this period is 880, and that's greater than TPE of 865. So in other words, and these, we're assuming these are in dollars. So in other words, the system produced $880 or 880 billion or 8.8 trillion or whatever it is, $880 of output, but households, businesses, government, and foreigners only purchased $865 worth of output. Look, if the producing sector knew, if the business sector knew that households, businesses, and government were only going to buy ahead of time, they knew it was only going to be 865, they would not have produced 880. They would have produced 865. So the problem is producers do not know exactly what the buyers, households, businesses, government, and foreigners will buy. So these don't have to be equal, and in this case they're not. In fact, we can make a note here. We want to start getting this idea in our head that demand is weak. Demand is weak. That households, businesses, government, and foreigners have not purchased enough output to cover all of the output that was produced. Okay? Now, what's going to happen? That's the question. This is the disequilibrium condition. We don't study disequilibrium because disequilibrium is that interesting. We study disequilibrium because we know that disequilibrium is going to move towards equilibrium. In other words, the system's going to move. So, and we're interested in these movements in the variables. So what's going to happen if GDP is greater than TPE? Well, let me use a different color here. Let's go to blue. What's going to happen? Well, the economy is going to experience something called unplanned inventory accumulation. In other words, the inventory stock, the amount of inventory that businesses are holding, is going to increase this period by $15. By the way, this is not good news. Businesses do not make profits when they make things and don't sell them. Okay? In other words, we produced too much. We made things and didn't sell them. Where did they end up? They ended up in inventory. There was an accumulation, a buildup of inventory that hadn't previously existed. Well, this is not good news because profits are actually what? Profits are actually lower than expected, and inventory levels are what? Higher than expected. So let me just illustrate this idea. So we can take a box here. Let's say, just draw a box. We'll call this our inventory stock. And so at the beginning of the year, think about this, at the beginning of the year, right at the beginning of this period, businesses brought inventory in from the previous period. In other words, businesses carry inventory across periods. So the business sector, the producing sector, already had in hand inventory when it came into the current year. What happened during the year? Well, during the year, the inventory level went up. It went up unexpectedly. By how much? By $15. This is your unplanned inventory accumulation. So this was an unplanned accumulation of inventory, and this is going to cause business people to change their behavior. You say, how so? Well, think about it. If you're a business person and your inventory levels are higher than expected, that tells you your customers have not purchased as much as you thought they were going to purchase. Demand has been weak. Well, how are you going to respond when demand is weak? What are you going to do? You're going to decrease your output rate. So we would expect this is going to lead to a decrease in the output rate. But if there's a decrease in the output rate, and we're just going to assume here that prices remain constant, we're going to ignore prices. You'd also expect prices to soften. You'd expect there to be a drop in prices, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We're just going to leave that out of the equation. Later in the course, we'll talk about this. Not later in these lessons, but in a later lesson, much later lesson, we'll look at price changes. So what is this going to do? Well, if the output rate decreases, GDP is going to decrease. GDP is a measure of the output rate. And remember, when the output rate decreases, we would expect that unemployment would go up, particularly cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is the unemployment that occurs when skilled people who want to work, who have the skills to work, can't find work because of weak business conditions. Okay? So this is actually a problem. This is actually a problem. And this is recessionary. Weak demand in the current period is going to be recessionary in future periods. This is called a recession. If it's bad enough, it's called a depression. Okay? So falling GDP is the outcome. This is not current GDP here. This is future. In the current period, GDP is 880. But what we're predicting through this model is that in future periods, GDP will be what? Will be less than GDP will be less than 880. It'll fall. And in fact, later on in the course, we're going to talk about how far it will fall. We'll actually be able to quantify that. Now let me show you, I want to show you one other thing here that's kind of an interesting piece of this. It used to be very, very popular for teachers of macroeconomic principles to talk about something called the bathtub theorem. And I'll just work that in here real quickly. I want to show you something. Why is this spending up here? Why is TPE weak? So the question is why? Why is spending weak this period? Okay. Well, we're going to explore this in much, much, much more detail. But to begin to understand this, we can use something called the bathtub theorem. So let me just draw a little model of a bathtub here. Here's a bathtub. Well, it's not a bathtub, it's a model of a bathtub. And of course, a bathtub has a faucet, it has a drain, and the level of water in the bathtub is ultimately going to be a function of the rate of inflow versus outflow. Now, there's the inflows come in through the inflow comes in through the faucet, and the outflow is through the drain. We're assuming here the bathtub is not got holes in it, cracks in it. Now, you can think of the level of water in this bathtub as GDP. Okay, GDP. So GDP is the level of water in the bathtub. Now, what are the three injections into the complex circular flow? Well, we've already talked about this. Planned investment, government expenditures, and exports. So investment, government purchases, and exports are actually what? Are actually the injections into the system. Okay, what are the three leakages? Well, the three leakages are savings, net taxes, and imports. Okay, so if the rate of injections equals the rate of saving, or excuse me, if the rate of injections equals the rate of leakages, you would expect what? The water level will stay constant. In other words, it will stay stable, which is equilibrium. So if the rate of inflow equals the rate of outflow from the circular flow, then the rate of GDP will stay constant. Okay? But in fact, that's not the case here. What we're going to see is the rate of outflow is greater than the rate of inflow. So let me go ahead and plug in the numbers here. So this is 145 given, this is 215 given, this is 180 given. If you add those together, you get 540. 540 is the rate of injection. Now, please be careful. Please, please, please be careful here. This is total planned. I didn't say actual. Total planned injections. Total planned injections. Now let's contrast that with the leakages. If you actually add up the saving in the system, now remember from earlier lessons that saving could be business saving and household saving. So we need to add up depreciation allowances, we need to add up retained earnings, we need to add up saving by households. If we add those together, we're going to get 150. If we add up all the taxes and subtract transfers, we get net taxes of 205. We've talked about that in earlier lessons. And imports are just given to us at what? 200. Well, if we add up the saving, the taxes, net of transfers, and the imports, what do we get? We get 555. The point is, the rate, and this would be the total leakages during the period. The point is, the total leakages exceed the total injections by $15. Look at that. The total leakages from the spending stream are greater by $15 than the total injections back into the spending stream. So spending is what? Spending is weak. How weak is it? Spending is weak. How weak is it? It is $15 weak. More money leaked out of the spending stream this period than came into the spending stream this period. Therefore, we've got weak spending. I can summarize this for you. Let me get this. I'm going to summarize this for you nice and tight. Okay, we'll go back to black. So if total leakages, this is planned, are greater than total injections, then spending will be weak. So GDP will be greater than TPE. In other words, you'll have weak spending. Again, the weak spending is due to this relationship here. If more is leaking out of the spending stream than coming into the spending stream during the period, spending will be weak. If GDP is greater than TPE, then there will be unplanned inventory accumulation. Now, think about this. Think about this. Let me use the numbers again that we were using. This was what? Leakages were what? 555. Injections were what? Injections were 540. How big was the difference here? How weak was GDP? How weak was TPE compared to GDP? Well, remember what GDP was. GDP was what? 880. TPE was what? 865. This $15 difference up here between 555 and 540 is the same $15 difference down here between 880 and 865, resulting in an unplanned inventory accumulation of $15. So because spending was weak, inventories accumulate. Well, why was spending weak? Because leakages were greater than injections. All right, well, let's finish this logic. Then if we just learned, if there's unplanned inventory accumulation, then what's going to happen? Then there's going to be a decrease in the output rate. And if there's a decrease in the output rate, then what's going to happen? Then there's going to be a decrease in GDP. And if there's a decrease in GDP, then there's going to be an increase in unemployment, the unemployment rate, specifically cyclical unemployment. So what we are basically building here is a model for a recession. All right, now I want to show you just a couple final things before we wrap up this lesson. It looks like, oh, I'm almost out of space here, and this lesson has probably gone on almost long enough. There's a couple more pieces I want to show you, a couple final ideas I want to build into this lesson. All right, so we said in an earlier lesson that if you take planned investment, you add it to unplanned investment, you get actual investment. Well, let's see what happens here. 145, this was given. What was our unplanned investment? Well, our unplanned investment was the unplanned inventory change. There was product made this period that was not sold. Where did it end up? It ended up in inventory. So this is your unplanned inventory accumulation. We talked about up above. And so what is actual investment this period? 160. So here's the issue. Businesses actually invested more than they planned to invest. How could they do? Well, they made product, thought they were going to sell it. They didn't sell it. It ended up in inventory, unintended. Their actual investment rate turned out to be higher than their planned investment rate. So IA is greater than I planned. This is not good news if you're a business person, because anything put into inventory is costing you something to hold, but you didn't earn the profit on it yet. That's not good news. Okay? One final point. Let's kind of close the loop here. We said in an earlier lesson that if you take C plus IA plus G plus X minus M, you must get, by definition, GDP. So actual expenditures excuse me, actual expenditures must equal GDP. That's called the expenditure approach. Total planned expenditures do not necessarily equal GDP, but actual expenditures must equal GDP. Well, let's prove it. This number is what? 525. This number is what? 160. This number is what? 215. This number is what? 180. This number is 200. What do we get? Well, this must equal 880, and it does. It checks. Notice we did not have this at the beginning, so we couldn't go the expenditure approach. We couldn't go directly after GDP. We actually found GDP using the income approach. We took national income, added back depreciation allowances, we got GDP. Remember, we took the 800, added the 80, and we got the 880. But that should coincide with the expenditure approach, and it does. Notice this 160. I again remind you, this 160 is made up of two pieces, planned and unplanned. When the government measures investment, what it sees is actual investment. It sees what businesses actually did. You go, well, why are you talking about this unplanned component? Well, it's the seed of change. When there's unplanned investment going on because of weak demand, businesses are going to change their output rates. So notice a very, very interesting final concluding thought here. If a company makes a product in the current year and sells it, it ends up being a part of consumption. So it gets counted as part of GDP. Okay, so if we make, a box of cereal, or Kellogg's, and we sell it this year, we make it this year and sell it this year, it's going to be counted as part of consumption. Okay, remember what GDP is. It's the dollar value of final output produced domestically within the what? Within the current year. Produced this year, sold this year, counted this year. However, what happens if a box of cereal is made, say, at the end of the year, but it's not sold until the following year? Well, if it's made this year, it has to be counted this year. It has to be counted as part of GDP this year. How is it going to enter the account? How is it going to enter the GDP calculation? Well, it wasn't sold to the final consumer. You can't count it as part of consumption. Well, if we make it and we don't sell it, it's going to be counted as what? Part of unplanned investment, which means it'll ultimately show up as part of IA. So something that is made and sold is counted as part of C. Something that is made and not sold, but still made this period, but not sold, is counted as part of I. Both of those affect GDP. All right, well, this concludes lesson number 2. In lesson number 3, what we're going to do is we're going to run the problem again, but we're going to run it in reverse. Here we looked at a case where GDP is greater than TPE. In our third lesson, we'll look at a case where TPE is greater than GDP.